Chapter 5. A Reluctant Sheriff. Expertly, Frank piloted the yellow convertible down the steep, winding rim road. As it passed the Thompsons' unpainted house at the foot, the boys caught sight of little Bobby on the front porch, his chin in his hands. "Poor kid," said Chet. "Reminds me, we haven't found any trace of his dog." "Maybe the pup has come home," Joe suggested. But Chet shook his head doubtfully. Bobby wouldn't look as if he'd lost his best friend, and Skippy would be with him. "You're probably right, Chet," Joe admitted. "Miss Thompson said many other dogs have disappeared around here. I'll bet it's the work of an animal thief." "But who would want to steal people's pets? And why?" demanded Chet, bewildered. At this, Frank chuckled. "Mrs. Thompson says the witch does it," he answered jokingly. To Frank's surprise, his brother received his suggestion seriously. "I'm convinced there's a tie-in between this witch and these lost dogs," Joe stated. "Don't forget, Captain Maguire connected them in his calendar notations. It all fits the witch legend." "Oh, cut it out, Joe," Chet protested nervously. "You don't really believe in that story?" "No," Joe replied, "but I'll bet plenty of other people around here do. The Pennsylvania Dutch settled in many areas, even over here. They weren't really Dutch, but Germans, who came to our country between 200 and 300 years ago for religious freedom. Anyhow, the old-timers brought some queer beliefs with them, such as the power of witches, charms, and spells. I've read that some of their descendants still hold on to these superstitions. Mrs. Thompson does," Chet put in. But Frank had already guessed what his brother was driving at. "Joe, do you think someone is deliberately trying to revive the witch legend by stealing dogs?" "Yes, I do, but don't ask me why." The drive to Forestburg, through sparsely inhabited country and over narrow, twisting roads, took nearly 2 hours. Joe, a keen student of history, used the time to comment on the customs of the people in the Pennsylvania Dutch country. After all, he reminded his companions, a belief in witches wasn't uncommon. The Puritans in New England believed in them too, you know. The car emerged from the hills and onto the main street of Forestburg. On one side, the cross streets climbed steeply upward. On the other, behind substantial frame houses, ran a swift mountain river. An old stone mill stood by the water. "That's where the people brought their grain for grinding in the old days," Joe pointed out. Another building with the name Gilder's General Store on the window attracted Chet's attention. Outside were bright washtubs, coils of rope, shiny new tools, and sacks of feed. "I'll get out here," the stout boy announced. "Somebody has to keep us in provisions while you two are busy with detective work." Frank barked, and Chet walked into the general store. The Hardys proceeded down the street to the country courthouse, a trim, white wooden building with round pillars supporting a wide porch in the front. The door to the county clerk's office pushed open under the pressure of Frank's knock. Inside, the boys could see a big, old-fashioned roll-top desk. Its many pigeonholes were stuffed with papers. The top of the desk, too, was littered, the various papers held down by 4 heavy metal paperweights. "Hello," Frank called. "Is anyone in?" In a moment, the door at the back of the office opened. A friendly, middle-aged woman wearing glasses entered. "Yes, boys. Mr. Fry, the clerk, has gone out. May I help you?" "We'd like to do some camping down in the Black Hollow," Frank answered. "We want to find out the owner's name and ask his permission." The woman, a native of the district, was able to answer the question without looking at any records. "My goodness, that whole valley has always belonged to the Donner family. But they've pretty much disappeared from around here. I don't know if there's any of them left now. The sheriff could tell you. He's across the hall." Frank made a brief note of the name Donner. Then he and Joe thanked her and went out. Joe tapped on the glass of the door marked Sheriff. "Come in," called a deep voice. A short, heavy-set man with thick iron-gray mustache was just replacing the receiver of his telephone. He seemed extremely busy. His vest hung open, revealing colorful suspenders, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up on his strong forearms. The sheriff turned in his swivel chair to face the Hardys, who quickly introduced themselves. They learned the official's name was Ecker. "Well, what's on your minds?" he demanded. Briefly, Frank and Joe related the facts of Captain Maguire's disappearance and expressed their fears for his safety. The sheriff listened with a preoccupied frown on his face and seemed to scarcely heed their story. "What do you want me to do?" he asked when they finished. "We want someone to come with us to help us search Black Hollow, sir," Frank replied promptly. Wearily, the sheriff shook his head. "Too late to get any kind of party together today," he said. "I'll be mighty lucky if I can do anything about it tomorrow. All my men, regulars and special deputies, are tied up trying to catch that gang hijacking goods from interstate trucks." Frank and Joe looked at each other thinking, Dad's case? "There's no time to waste," Joe pleaded urgently. "Captain Maguire's life may be in danger." "Now take it easy, boys," the sheriff's gruff manner softened. "Maybe your friend just went for a hike alone. He might even be back in his cabin right now, waiting for you fellows. I can't pull my men off this other job without more evidence." "But we found his flashlight," Joe persisted. "And also the shotgun, blood-stained leaves, and pieces of cloth." Sheriff Ecker sighed. "I just haven't the men today. I'll do my best to get a party together in the morning, but I won't promise." "There must be somebody around who could help us," Joe insisted. Sheriff Ecker had already begun to study the report in front of him. Suddenly he looked up. "Now that I think of it, there's Mr. Donner, who lives down in the hollow all by himself. He must know every stone and bush in that place. His family has owned it since way back, you see. He'll be very glad to help you boys, because that's the kind of man he is, always very friendly and helpful." At this news, the Hardy brothers exchanged a quick, puzzled look. "Did you say he lives in the hollow?" Frank asked. "Yes, I don't know where his cabin is, myself. I've never been there. But I guess you can find it." Frank and Joe left the courthouse and found Chet waiting for them in the car. On the back seat were 3 big bags filled with groceries. "Found a nice place where we can have lunch," he announced cheerfully. "How did you two make out?" "Terrible," Joe replied flatly. "Sheriff's too busy to help us. Looks as if we're out on our own." "What do you think, Frank? Shall we call Dad? We can reach him through the New Jersey State Police headquarters." "He might have some suggestions," Frank agreed. "If you're thinking of telephoning," Chet put in importantly, "better listen to me first. I found out a few things about this town. Know who the biggest gossip in Forestburg is? Mrs. Giller, the wife of the owner of the general store. Know who any local telephone operator is? Mrs. Giller. Anything confidential you have to say to your father will be heard by Mrs. Giller." "I get you," Joe said. "There's not much Dad could do right now anyhow," he added. "And at least we ought to give the sheriff a chance to come through with a search party. If that doesn't work out, then we can see what Dad suggests." "Right," Frank nodded. "We have to wait till morning, and if no searchers arrive, we'll hunt up this Mr. Donner." "Do you suppose he lives in that queer little house?" Joe asked. "Could be," Frank answered. "We didn't see any other cabin through the field glasses." Frank had started the car, and he followed Chet's directions to a diner. It proved to be an excellent eating place. Hot, juicy hamburgers and milk soon revived the boys' energy. Frank spoke with optimism. "I've been thinking about the search," he told the others. "I have an idea for going ahead on our own." Eagerly, Chet and Joe gave him their attention. "We're going to an animal auction," Frank announced. An animal auction? Joe echoed. Where? On the outskirts of the next town. I saw the advertisement in the window of Giller's store as we went by. The auction is being held today, and it ought to be starting in half an hour. But what are we going to buy? Chet wanted to know. Not an animal. We sure are. A dog, Frank answered. A dog to bait a trap. We'll take him back to Captain Maguire's cabin. If somebody's been stealing dogs, I just hope he tries to take ours, because we're going to be ready for him. Great idea, Joe said enthusiastically. Well, okay, agreed Chet doubtfully, as long as we're careful. I'd hate to see harm come to any dog. Don't worry, Chet, Frank assured him. We'll be on guard. A few minutes later, the boys started off once more. As they left the tiny village, the ride became increasingly bumpy. Wow, Joe exclaimed. This sure is a washboard road. Must have been built in the horse and buggy days. Recent heavy rains had gullied the roadbed and left large exposed stones that pounded the tires unmercifully. After descending a long hill, a series of hairpin turns, the car approached a small iron railing bridge across a deep chasm. The waters of an overfull mountain river turned below. The sign on the bridge read, "Capacity load, 5 tons. Guess you'll have to swim over, Chet." Frank said jokingly. The plump boy snorted indignantly as the big convertible rolled onto the planks of the bridge. When it was halfway across, a splintering, cracking sound gave warning that the wooden planks were giving way. "We're gonna crash through!" Chet yelled. End of chapter 5.